Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into this fascinating exploration of how humanity maps, claims, and irreversibly alters the planet. Today, we're looking at the concept of claiming the uncharted. And look, this isn't just dusty history. Maps are power. The way we draw lines on the globe has completely defined human history, and right now, at this very moment, it's actively shaping our survival and our future in ways you might not even realize.
So how exactly do we claim the unknown? This one simple question has driven centuries of geopolitics, from the smoke-filled map rooms of 19th century Europe all the way to modern high-tech labs studying the abyssal plains of the ocean. The way we define ownership over new frontiers changes absolutely everything. And as we look downward into the crushing depths of the deep ocean, and even outward into space, it's a question we frankly still haven't fully answered.
To wrap our heads around this unified story, we're going to hit 5 key areas today. Claiming the uncharted, the Scramble for Africa, when new islands emerge, mining the deep ocean, and finally, rewriting the global map. Let's get into it.
All right, part 1. Claiming the uncharted, or basically the urge to claim the unclaimed. We really need to start with the legal foundations empires use to justify drawing lines on a map in the first place.
Now, what's just absolutely wild about this concept is how this single legal myth of terra nullius, which literally translates to nobody's land, fueled an entire era of global imperial expansion. I mean, it was an incredibly convenient legal loophole. It allowed colonizing powers to look at a vast, heavily populated continent, deem the territory uninhabited or, quote-unquote uncivilized by their own narrow European definitions, and legally justify just taking it for themselves. It completely and deliberately ignored the rich, complex human reality that was already existing on the ground.
Moving right along to part 2, the Scramble for Africa, European balance of power versus African sovereignty. This brings us to a historical period where European cartography violently collided with African reality.
See, the crucial thing to understand here is that European powers aggressively used that terra nullius narrative to completely dismiss massive, centralized political and economic structures that were already thriving in Africa. European mapmakers perpetuated this absolute myth of an empty land. But that stood in stark contrast to the reality on the ground. You had these highly sophisticated pre-colonial polities, vast powers like the Sokoto Caliphate, which was this massive Islamic state with complex administration, or the Asante Empire, known for its immense gold wealth and highly organized military structure. These societies had established trade networks and complex diplomacy, and they were entirely erased from European maps with just the stroke of a pen.
So, to keep from just constantly fighting each other over all this territory, European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, and instead of recognizing African sovereignty, they basically invented a brand new rule called effective occupation. To legitimize a territorial claim, a European power had to essentially prove they had boots on the ground, an administrative, security, and economic presence there. But notice who wasn't at the table. There was a total glaring absence of African voices in these diplomatic negotiations. They were completely locked out of the map-making process that was dividing up their own homes.
And this whole situation perfectly, and quite tragically, illustrates the horrific disconnect between high-minded legal frameworks and human reality. Take the Congo Free State, for example. King Leopold II of Belgium established this massive area as his own personal, private fiefdom. He hid the whole thing behind a facade of philanthropy and the humanitarian rhetoric of the Berlin Act. But the reality? It was colonial capitalism at its most absolute and brutal. He implemented a concession system that led to the rubber terror, enforcing impossible rubber quotas through systematic violence, forced labor, and mutilation. It wasn't until early whistleblowers like George Washington Williams in his 1890 open letter and later the meticulous documentation of the Casement Report that the true scale of these abuses was actually exposed to the world. And that sparked some of the earliest international human rights activism we've ever seen.
And we are still feeling the heavy legacy of this geometric partition today. When African nations finally gained independence in the mid-20th century, the Organization of African Unity adopted the principle of iudi possidetis. It basically meant newly independent nations would retain the exact same borders they had as colonies. This left a devastating geopolitical legacy. It locked in these artificial states and rigid borders that split entirely cohesive ethno-linguistic communities right down the middle. It created enormous friction and conflicts that still impact the continent's stability today. What you should really take away from this is that lines drawn on a map by distant powers have very real, very permanent consequences for generations of people living on the ground. If we look at the timeline here, you can actually see this urge to claim territory evolving. We go from partitioning African land in 1884 to suddenly needing rules for the uncharted ocean. By 1958, post-World War II technology made offshore drilling a reality, so the Geneva Conventions began establishing the law of the sea to govern the continental shelf. But what happens when the physical geography of the Earth itself changes? That brings us to 1974, when a Japanese vessel made a startling discovery that put these new laws to the ultimate test.
Which leads perfectly into Part 3, when new islands emerge. Maritime law and shifting geography. I mean, think about it. What actually happens to international borders when a piece of land literally just rises right out of the ocean?
Well, academic legal texts have explored a fascinating real-world scenario around this exact phenomenon. Back in March 1974, a Japanese fishing vessel, and later U.S. patrols, encountered a previously unknown, highly shallow area between the Volcano and Mariana Islands. These islands sit right on the volcanic ring of fire. And it's just this incredible geological process. Liquid rock violently erupting and striking cold ocean water, rapidly cooling and depositing new rock just beneath the surface. Over time, these subterranean mountains can build up until they suddenly breach the surface and become brand new dry land.
Talk about a modern territorial scramble, right? If a new island arises entirely outside the internal waters of any recognized state, who does it belong to? Legal scholars note that while the 1958 Geneva Conventions apply to the continental shelf, claiming a newly emerged isolated island actually relies on much older, customary international law doctrines, things like contiguity, or in this specific deep-sea location, occupation and discovery. And the stakes here are astronomically high. We aren't just talking about a barren rock. We're talking about an exclusive economic zone, where that new island's surrounding continental shelf could contain incredibly valuable, untapped mineral resources.
And speaking of those hidden resources, that brings us to Part 4, mining the deep ocean, the modern resource rush. The stakes of claiming the ocean floor have never been higher.
Way down in the deep ocean, mostly below a crushing 1,000 meters of water, there are massive deposits of minerals that we absolutely rely on for modern tech. We're talking about huge deposits of cobalt, copper, manganese, and rare earth elements. These are the essential, non-negotiable building blocks for electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, and solar panels. And they exist in three main forms down there. First, you've got polymetallic nodules, which are these potato-sized rocks just scattered loosely across vast abyssal plains. Second, cobalt-rich crusts, which are layered tightly on underwater mountains over millions of years. And third, seafloor massive sulfides, found at hydrothermal vents where superheated water escapes the Earth's crust. As we transition to renewable energy, the global demand for these specific minerals is just skyrocketing.
But, and this is a massive but, the trade-off here is incredibly steep. The deep ocean is one of Earth's absolute last unexplored frontiers. It is an alien world home to highly specialized, fragile life forms that have evolved in total darkness and stable, freezing conditions over millions of years. Extracting these minerals poses severe, potentially irreversible ecological threats. Industrial mining could stir up massive sediment plumes that travel for hundreds of miles on deep ocean currents, completely choking filter-feeding animals. It involves the physical destruction of habitats that take millennia to form, introduces harmful industrial noise and blazing light pollution into a pitch-black world, and risks toxic chemical contamination. It's a huge, huge risk.
And this is exactly why rigorous, independent science is just so crucial right now. I mean, we can't manage what we don't understand, right? Projects like SmartTax, led by the National Oceanography Center, are actively surveying 6 million square kilometers of the Central Pacific. They are literally racing against the clock to establish accurate environmental baselines before any commercial mining operations are legally allowed to begin. We desperately need this rigorous data to design effective marine protected areas and strict environmental standards so we don't just repeat the blind, destructive resource exploitation of our past.
All right, Part 5, rewriting the global map where geography is destiny. So we've talked about politics shaping maps and maritime law desperately reacting to new islands. But what happens when physical geography drastically rewrites the rules for the whole planet?
Okay, I want to share this incredibly fascinating world-building thought experiment I came across from an online mapping forum. Think about the fundamental shapes of our continents. What if tectonic plates had simply ripped apart differently millions of years ago, and instead of just a submerged mid-Atlantic ridge, a massive new continent snaked right up through the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean?
The implications of just that one geological change are honestly staggering.
On our Earth, the open North Atlantic Gyre and the Gulf Stream act as a massive, continuous conveyor belt. They rapidly funnel warm tropical water north, essentially acting as a giant space heater for Europe. But on this alternate Earth, that new mid-Atlantic landmass would act as a giant impenetrable dam. It would completely block the Gulf Stream. Without that warm water flowing in, Great Britain, Ireland, and northern France would be plunged into a brutal, freezing climate, similar to the harsh winters of Newfoundland or Siberia. It brilliantly illustrates how the physical, unyielding layout of our world entirely dictates the flow of resources, climate, and ultimately the entire course of human civilization. Geography truly is destiny.
And that brings us to the ultimate question we want to leave you with today. We've seen the devastating, multi-generational legacy of claiming nobody's land in Africa. We've seen the complex legal puzzles of brand new islands emerging from the sea, and we are currently facing the incredibly high-stakes trade-offs of the deep-sea resource rush. As humanity ventures downward into the pitch-black depths to secure the materials we need to fuel our green future, we've got a profound choice to make. Think carefully about how we claim the unknown. Will we learn from the map-making mistakes of our past, or are we just going to draw new lines of destruction? Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.